At 10:35 a.m. on the 17th of December 1903, a machine lifted off from a sandy dune near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. It was a biplane constructed of spruce and muslin, powered by a four-cylinder engine of the brothers' own design. The pilot lay prone on the lower wing, his hips cradled in a movable cradle that controlled the warping of the wingtips. The machine rose unsteadily into a wind measured at 27 miles per hour. It stayed aloft for 12 seconds. It traveled 120 feet. Then it settled back onto the sand. 3 more flights followed that morning. The longest lasted 59 seconds and covered 852 feet. Then a gust of wind caught the machine, tumbling it across the beach. It never flew again. But what happened in those 12 seconds altered the course of human history. What happened? The place was the Outer Banks of North Carolina, a chain of narrow barrier islands separating the Atlantic Ocean from Albemarle Sound. The Wright brothers had chosen this location deliberately. It was remote, sparsely populated, and offered steady winds and soft landing surfaces. They had been coming here for 4 years, first testing gliders, then gradually adding control surfaces and an engine. By 1903, they had solved problems that had stumped inventors for centuries. They understood that powered flight required 3 things: lift, thrust, and control. Others had pursued the first 2. The Wrights were the first to master the third. Wilbur and Orville Wright operated a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. They had no formal engineering training, no university degrees, and no government funding. They learned through observation, experiment, and failure. Their early gliders at Kitty Hawk had taught them that existing aerodynamic data was unreliable. So they built their own wind tunnel, testing over 200 wing shapes to find the most efficient one. They developed a system of 3-axis control using wing warping, a movable rudder, and an elevator. They built their own engine when no manufacturer could meet their weight requirements. They designed their own propellers from scratch, treating them as rotating wings rather than simple blades. By the winter of 1903, they had assembled a machine that weighed 605 pounds and could generate 12 horsepower. The morning of December 17th began cold and windy. The brothers had spent weeks waiting for favorable conditions. The day before, they had tested the engine and found it misfiring. They repaired it. At dawn, the wind was blowing from the north at 22 miles per hour. They knew that if they waited much longer, winter storms would force them to abandon the season. They decided to try. They laid a 60-foot launching rail along the sand, pointed into the wind. They attached a wheeled dolly to the machine and launched it from the rail. Orville took the first turn. Wilbur ran alongside, steadying the wingtip until the machine lifted. Orville later described the flight as erratic, bucking up and down like a horse. But it flew. At 10:35, it left the ground. At 10:35 and 12 seconds, it touched down again. Who were these men, and why did they succeed where so many others had failed? Wilbur Wright was born in 1867. Orville followed 4 years later. They lived in a household that encouraged curiosity and hard work. Their father, a bishop in the Church of the United Brethren in Christ, brought home a small helicopter toy when the boys were young. It was made of paper, bamboo, and cork, powered by a rubber band. They played with it until it broke, then built their own copies. That toy never left them. As adults, they became obsessed with the problem of flight after reading about the death of Otto Lilienthal, a German glider pioneer who crashed and died in 1896. They wrote to the Smithsonian Institution for papers on aeronautics. They read everything available. They concluded that the essential problem was not generating lift or thrust. It was maintaining equilibrium. A machine that could not be controlled was useless, no matter how well it flew. Between 1900 and 1902, the Wrights tested 3 gliders at Kitty Hawk. The first 2 performed poorly. They had relied on data from others, and that data was wrong. The third glider, after they corrected the data with their own wind tunnel experiments, became the most successful glider ever built. It flew hundreds of times. They learned to coordinate wing warping with rudder deflection, a technique they called banking. Without this coordination, turns were dangerous. With it, the machine was stable and controllable. By 1902, they were making glides of over 600 feet. They had solved control. Now they needed power. No engine manufacturer could build one light enough. So they built their own with help from their mechanic, Charlie Taylor. It took 6 weeks. The block was cast from aluminum, an unusual choice for the time. The crankshaft was machined from steel. The fuel was gasoline, gravity-fed from a tank mounted to a wing strut. The engine weighed 180 pounds and produced 12 horsepower. They also designed 2 propellers, each 8 feet in diameter, rotating in opposite directions to cancel torque. The calculations for those propellers were brilliant, years ahead of contemporary theory. When the machine was assembled at Kitty Hawk in September 1903, the propellers were less than perfectly efficient, but they worked. The engine, however, did not. A propeller shaft cracked during a ground test. They sent the shaft back to Dayton for repair. A new one arrived in November. Then another cracked. By early December, they were repairing damage faster than they could test. The weather turned worse. They nearly gave up. What investigators later pieced together from their journals and correspondence reveals the tension of those final weeks. The brothers were exhausted and running out of money. They had spent less than $1,000 of their own funds on the project, but the cost in time and effort was far greater. They argued with each other. Wilbur wanted to return to Dayton. Orville wanted to stay. In the end, they stayed. On December 14th, they attempted a flight. Wilbur took the controls. The machine lifted too steeply, stalled, and settled back onto the sand after 3.5 seconds. The landing broke a skid. Repairs took 2 days. On December 16th, the wind was too light. On December 17th, the wind was strong enough. They decided to try again. The launch system was simple. A wire held the machine in place while the engine warmed up. When the wire was released, the machine rolled forward along the rail. The pilot worked the controls. The wind provided lift. On the first flight, Orville was at the controls. The flight was short and shaky, barely above the sand. But Orville was alive at the end of it, and the machine was intact. That alone was an achievement. No powered aircraft had ever flown with a pilot aboard and returned safely. The second flight at 11 a.m. with Wilbur at the controls covered 200 feet in 12 seconds. The third, at 11:20 a.m. with Orville again, covered 200 feet in 15 seconds. The fourth and final flight at noon with Wilbur at the controls covered 852 feet in 59 seconds. It ended when the machine pitched down and struck the sand. The front elevator was damaged, but the airplane was flyable. As the brothers stood in the wind discussing what they had done, a gust of wind caught the machine and rolled it end over end down the beach. It was destroyed. The Wrights carried the pieces back to their camp. They had made 4 flights. They had proven that powered, controlled, sustained flight was possible. And then their machine was gone. How could this have happened, and why did it matter? The destruction of the machine was an accident, a result of inexperience with handling a powered aircraft on the ground. But the loss did not erase the accomplishment. The Wrights knew what they had done. They sent a telegram home to their father, success 4 flights Thursday morning, inform press, home Christmas. The press, however, was skeptical. Many newspapers did not believe the story. Some reported it as a hoax. Others buried it in short paragraphs. The Scientific American magazine expressed doubt. For years, the Wright brothers were dismissed by the French and European aeronautical communities. It was not until 1908, after a series of public demonstrations in France and the United States, that the world accepted what had happened at Kitty Hawk. Why did people not believe? Because the Wrights had made their flights in secret. They were secretive by nature and by necessity. They had filed a patent in 1903 and were determined to protect their invention from competitors. They stopped flying at Kitty Hawk after 1903 and spent the next 2 years building better machines at a field near Dayton. They did not invite reporters. They did not release photographs until 1908. By that time, others were catching up. Glenn Curtiss, Alexander Graham Bell, and Samuel Langley were all working on flying machines. The Wrights had to defend their patent in court, a fight that would consume their energies for years. But the deeper story is not about patents or publicity. It is about systems. The Wright brothers succeeded because they approached flight as a problem of systems, not single breakthroughs. They understood that an airplane is a collection of interdependent parts. Wings provide lift, engine provides thrust, control surfaces provide stability and maneuverability. If any one of these fails, the machine fails. They also understood that flight requires the pilot to be part of the system. Orville and Wilbur were both pilots. They learned to fly through trial and error, crashing, repairing, and flying again. They had no instructors, no simulators, no textbooks. They taught themselves. Why does this event still matter over 120 years later? Because the 12 seconds at Kitty Hawk represent a threshold. Before December 17, 1903, human beings were bound to the ground. After it, they were not. Every flight taken since, whether by a passenger jet, a military fighter, or a private plane, traces its lineage back to that morning on a North Carolina beach. The technology has changed beyond recognition, but the principles remain the same: lift, thrust, control. The Wrights did not invent the airplane as we know it today. They invented the system of controlled flight that made the airplane possible. The systems they built were fragile and flawed. The engine was underpowered. The airframe was weak. The pilot had little protection. But the machine worked because the Wrights had thought through the entire problem. They had not simply built a flying machine. They had built a system for learning how to fly. They kept journals. They recorded every flight, every wind speed, every modification. They analyzed failures and corrected them. They did not rely on luck. They relied on measurement. What the investigators of the Germanwings disaster found was a failure of systems in a different sense: medical reporting, cockpit security, pilot monitoring. What the Wrights found was a success of systems: careful observation, iterative testing, relentless refinement. Both stories are about how human beings construct and maintain complex machines. Both are about the consequences when those systems work and when they fail. The 1903 Wright Flyer was not a comfortable machine. The pilot lay flat on the lower wing, exposed to wind and cold. The engine vibrated violently. The controls required constant attention. In the 12 seconds of the first flight, Orville Wright had no time to feel triumph. He was fighting to keep the machine level. It is worth remembering that neither brother ever flew the Flyer again after that December morning. They dismantled it, packed it away, and moved on to the next design. They did not dwell on their success. They saw it as a step, not a destination. By 1905, they had built a practical airplane capable of flying over 30 minutes and covering 24 miles. By 1908, they were performing public demonstrations that stunned the world. By 1909, they were flying for the United States Army. The Wright Company was founded. Patent wars erupted. Wilbur died of typhoid fever in 1912 at the age of 45. Orville lived until 1948, long enough to see jet aircraft, the breaking of the sound barrier, and the beginning of the commercial aviation industry. He never stopped defending his brother's legacy. But the moment that started it all was a 12-second flight that almost no one witnessed. The only people present were the Wright brothers themselves, 4 men from the Kill Devil Hills life-saving station, a boy from the village, and a teenager named Johnny Moore. There was no official photographer. Orville had set up a camera on a tripod and asked John T. Daniels, one of the lifesavers, to press the shutter release just as the machine lifted. Daniels had never used a camera before. He captured the moment perfectly. That single photograph of the Flyer rising off the rail with Wilbur running alongside has become one of the most reproduced images in history. It shows an invention that was at once primitive and revolutionary, a machine that barely worked yet changed everything. What happened at Kitty Hawk was not just a scientific achievement. It was a human achievement born of patience, discipline, and the willingness to fail. The Wright brothers failed many times. Their gliders crashed. Their engines broke. Their machine was destroyed at the end of the first day of flight. But they never stopped asking what was wrong and how to fix it. That method, more than any single discovery, is what made them succeed. And yet the question remains, why Kitty Hawk? Why not some other place, some other time, some other brothers? The answer lies in the convergence of conditions. The winds of the Outer Banks were steady. The sand was soft. The isolation provided privacy. The Wrights had the right temperament for isolation. They worked well together despite their differences. Wilbur was the visionary, the strategist. Orville was the mechanic, the perfectionist. Together, they formed a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. They trusted each other completely. That trust allowed them to take risks that others would not. The memory of that December morning fades with time, but the trajectory it set remains. Every time a plane takes off, every time a rocket clears the atmosphere, every time a drone lifts into the sky, it is a continuation of those 12 seconds. The Wright brothers did not just invent a machine. They invented a direction, and that direction has not reversed. On August 8, 1908, at a racecourse in Le Mans, France, Wilbur Wright prepared for a public flight that would finally silence the skeptics. He had arrived in France months earlier, but weather and mechanical delays had kept him grounded. Now the crowd had gathered. French aviators, journalists, and officials stood watching. Many of them had worked on flying machines themselves. They had seen failures. They had built their own aircraft. They did not believe the Wright brothers had achieved sustained, controlled flight in 1903. They thought the story was exaggerated or fabricated. Wilbur knew that. He had traveled across the Atlantic to prove them wrong. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the wind was light. Wilbur checked the machine. It was a Wright Model A, the successor to the 1903 Flyer, with a more powerful engine and improved controls. He had been testing it in secret for weeks at a nearby field. Now he would fly in the open. He climbed into the pilot's seat, adjusted the controls, and signaled the ground crew. The machine moved forward on its rail, lifted off, and climbed into the air. It banked left. It turned. It flew a figure eight. It circled the field. The crowd went silent. Then they cheered. By the time Wilbur landed after 1 minute and 45 seconds, the demonstration was over. The skeptics had been answered. The French aviators, including Louis Blériot and Alberto Santos Dumont, could not deny what they had seen. The Wright machine could turn, bank, and fly with precision. It was not a hop. It was controlled flight. Newspapers that had called the brothers liars now printed retractions. The scientific community that had dismissed the 1903 report began to study the patents. But the flight at Le Mans came with a cost. The Wrights had spent years protecting their invention. They had not flown publicly because they were afraid of losing control of their design. By 1908, they had patents in multiple countries, but infringement was already occurring. Glenn Curtis, a motorcycle racer turned aircraft builder, was developing his own machines. He used ailerons for lateral control, a system that the Wrights argued was covered by their patent on wing warping. The legal battle that began in 1909 would last nearly a decade. On September 17, 1908, at Fort Myer, Virginia, Orville Wright was conducting demonstrations for the U.S. Army. He had already completed several successful flights. The Army was ready to purchase a flying machine. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Orville took off with Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge as a passenger. They climbed to an altitude of about 150 feet. Then a propeller blade split. The vibration snapped a wire which struck the propeller. The blade shattered, throwing the machine off balance. Orville cut the engine and tried to glide, but the aircraft stalled and fell. Selfridge was killed. Orville was severely injured with a broken leg and ribs. That crash was the first fatal accident in powered aviation history. It raised a question that would echo through the entire history of flight. How could a simple mechanical failure lead to such a disaster? Investigators examined the wreckage. They found that the propeller blade had developed a crack from stress. The Wrights had used a standard wood propeller design. They had not reinforced the blade at the hub. The crack propagated during flight. When the blade failed, the loss of thrust caused asymmetric drag, which made the machine uncontrollable. No backup system existed. No redundant propeller. No second engine. The machine had been designed for lightness and efficiency, not safety. What happened then was a shift in aviation design. After the Fort Myer crash, engineers began to think about reliability differently. They started to build engines with fail-safe mechanisms, stronger propeller hubs, and structural redundancies. But the Wrights themselves were not entirely prepared for the public responsibility of flight. They had built experimental machines. They were learning as they went, and sometimes the lessons were fatal. How could the Wrights have prevented the crash? The question is obvious but not easy to answer. At the time, there was no systematic testing of components under repeated stress. The Wrights did not have a fatigue testing lab. They relied on visual inspection and experience. They had flown hundreds of glider and powered flights without a propeller failure. But experience is only a guide until the next failure. The accident at Fort Myer forced the entire aviation community to adopt more rigorous engineering standards, including static load testing and inspection protocols. By 1909, the Wrights had recovered. Orville healed. The Army ordered their first airplane, the Wright military flyer, which cost $30,000. It was delivered in June 1909. The brothers established the Wright Company. They hired mechanics and pilots. They trained students. They continued to improve their machines. The 1909 Flyer could reach speeds of 40 miles per hour, fly for over an hour, and carry 2 people. But the patent war with Curtiss consumed most of their revenue and attention. Wilbur traveled to Europe to testify in lawsuits. Orville stayed in Dayton to run the factory. The patent battle reached the U.S. Circuit Court in 1913, when the court ruled in favor of the Wrights. The decision effectively gave them a monopoly on aircraft manufacturing in the United States, but the victory was hollow. The aviation industry needed competition to advance. By the time the patent expired in 1918, other countries had already overtaken the United States in aircraft design. The Wrights had won the legal war, but they lost their chance to lead the industry into the modern age. Wilbur Wright died on May 30, 1912, while visiting Dayton. He had contracted typhoid fever, likely from contaminated food or water. At his death, he was 45 years old. Orville was devastated. They had worked together for 2 decades, sharing every insight, every failure, and every success. Without Wilbur, Orville struggled to continue. He sold his interest in the Wright Company in 1905. He spent the rest of his life as a consultant and an advocate for aviation safety, but he never designed another aircraft. In 1928, the Wright brothers' 1903 flyer was sent to the Science Museum in London for preservation. It remained there until 1948, when Orville, shortly before his death, arranged for it to be returned to the United States. It now hangs in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Orville Wright died on January 30, 1948. His last public statement was a simple one. The satisfaction of seeing the aircraft that we built become a means of transportation for the world was a greater reward than any I could have imagined. But the story of the Wright brothers is not only about success. It is about what happens when a small group of people refuses to accept that a problem is unsolvable. The Wrights faced doubt from the press, harassment from patent lawyers, and the trauma of fatal crashes. They encountered official resistance from military and scientific authorities who did not believe in them. The question of why it took 5 years for the world to accept their achievement is still debated. Some argue it was their own secrecy. Others blame the arrogance of the European establishment. Still others point to the technical challenges of reproducing their results without detailed documentation. On the morning of December 17, 1903, the wind was cold and steady from the north. Orville Wright lay on the lower wing of the flyer. The machine was held in place by a simple restraint. Wilbur stood beside the wing, steadying it. The engine was running. At exactly 10:35, the machine slid forward on its monorail. John T. Daniels, a lifesaver from the Kill Devil Hills station, squeezed the rubber bulb on the camera shutter. The flyer lifted from the rail and climbed into the air. It did not go far, it did not go fast, but it flew. How many seconds passed? 12. In those 12 seconds, the machine covered 120 feet. It rose to an altitude of about 10 feet. It was not stable. The pilot struggled with the controls. The machine sank and rose. It touched down hard on the sand, splintering the skids, but it did not crash. It landed. Orville had flown. Later that day, the flyer made 3 more flights. Wilbur flew the longest, covering 852 feet in 59 seconds. Then a gust of wind caught the machine after landing and rolled it over, smashing the engine and chain guides. The Wrights did not repair it. They packed up and returned to Dayton. They did not know that the machine they left behind would become the most important artifact in the history of transportation. But why does that 12-second flight still command our attention? Because it represents a moment when the intentional design of a system aligned with the forces of nature. The Wrights understood that flight requires control. They understood that lift is useless without stability. They understood that power is meaningless without steering. The 1903 Flyer was not the first machine to leave the ground. It was the first machine to leave the ground with a pilot who could decide where it went. That is the line that was crossed on December 17, 1903. Everything before was a hop. Everything after was flight. What happened at Kitty Hawk was not a single event. It was the end of a process that began in 1899 with a simple kite. Wilbur Wright had written to the Smithsonian Institution asking for information about flying machines. He received a list of failures. He studied them. He realized that previous inventors had not solved the problem of control. They had focused on lift and power, but they had neglected the third element, the ability to steer. So the Wrights designed a kite that could be twisted in opposite directions on each side. This was wing warping, a system that allowed them to bank the kite and change direction. They tested it in their bicycle shop in Dayton. It worked. Then they built gliders and tested them at Kitty Hawk in 1900, 1901, and 1902. Each glider taught them something new. The 1901 glider did not lift enough. They discovered that the published aerodynamic data from Otto Lilienthal and others was wrong. They built their own wind tunnel and took their own measurements. The 1902 glider was redesigned with a vertical tail to prevent side slipping. It flew 3 times longer than any previous glider. By 1903, they knew how to fly. All they needed was an engine. They could not find a manufacturer who could build a light enough engine, so they built their own. It produced 12 horsepower and weighed 180 pounds. It was crude, but it worked. They also built their own propellers, carving them from laminated spruce. They understood that a propeller is not just a windmill. It is a rotating wing that generates thrust. That understanding came from systematic experimentation. The Wright brothers were not geniuses in the romantic sense. They were engineers in the practical sense. They kept notebooks. They recorded their failures. They argued with each other. They were stubborn, secretive, and sometimes unfair to their competitors. But they were also relentless in their method. That method, more than any single discovery, is what made them succeed. Today, when a passenger jet takes off from a runway, it uses control surfaces that trace directly back to the Wright's wing warping and rudder system. The engines are vastly more powerful. The cockpit is filled with electronics. The materials are carbon fiber and titanium. But the fundamentals remain: lift from wings, thrust from engines, control from surfaces that change the airflow. Every pilot learns the same principles that Orville and Wilbur wrote in their journals. What would the Wright brothers think of modern aviation? They would be astonished by the size, speed, and safety of modern aircraft. They would be puzzled by the complexity of air traffic control, the number of passengers, and the global network of routes. But they would recognize the machine. They would look at the wings, the tail, the propellers, and the landing gear and see their own design principles, refined over a century. And yet, the 12 seconds at Kitty Hawk remain a benchmark. It is the moment the human race stopped being earthbound. That threshold has never been crossed back. To cross, it required a convergence of conditions on a remote beach in North Carolina. It required two brothers who refused to accept that the problem was too hard. It required four men from a life-saving station who helped launch a machine they did not understand. It required a camera operated by a man who had never taken a photograph. The image that survives shows the Wright flyer in the air just after takeoff. The angle is slightly low. The machine is black against the pale sky. The sand around it is still. There is no crowd. There is no ceremony. There is only the machine, the pilot, and the moment. That moment is why we are still talking about the Wright brothers more than 100 years later. It is why the places, dates, and times have been preserved in aviation history. It is why the patents, the legal battles, the crashes, and the triumphs are studied. Because for 12 seconds on December 17, 1903, at 10:35 in the morning, everything changed. And the direction that was set that morning has not reversed. After the Wright brothers returned to Dayton in early 1904, they did not announce their success. No newspaper carried the story. No telegram was sent to the Smithsonian. They simply packed the remains of the flyer, shipped them home, and began planning for the next season. The world did not know what had happened at Kitty Hawk. For the next 2 years, the Wrights continued to fly in complete secrecy, hidden from view on a flat pasture 8 miles east of Dayton called Huffman Prairie. On May 23, 1904, they tested their second powered machine, the Flyer II. It was heavier, with a slightly more powerful engine, and they launched it from a single rail using a falling weight to accelerate it. The first flight was short. They struggled with the same problems of pitch stability that had plagued the 1903 flights, but they kept at it. Over the next few months, they made dozens of flights, gradually learning to turn the machine in a circle. On September 20, 1904, Wilbur Wright flew the first complete circle in history. The flight lasted 1 minute and 36 seconds. Still no one outside a small circle knew, but there were witnesses. Amos Root, a beekeeper and amateur naturalist, had heard rumors and traveled to Huffman Prairie. He saw the flights and wrote an article for his own magazine, Gleanings in Bee Culture. That article, published in January 1905, described the machine lifting off, turning, and landing. Root was astonished. He wrote, "I saw the flying machine. It was not a dream. It was a reality." But the article was read mostly by beekeepers. Mainstream newspapers remained skeptical or oblivious. Throughout 1905, the Wrights perfected their third machine. The Flyer III was significantly different. A longer frame, a more responsive elevator, a new system of controls that separated the wing warping from the rudder. On June 23, 1905, they made their first flight of the season. By October, they were flying routinely for more than 30 minutes. On October 5th, Wilbur flew 24 miles in 39 minutes and 23 seconds. The machine had become practical. It could take off, fly, turn, and land at a controlled spot. At that point, the Wrights stopped flying. They had no more money to risk on experiments, and they wanted to secure patents and a buyer before anyone else could catch up. They did not fly again for nearly 3 years. But while they waited, the world began to move. In Europe, inventors were making progress. In France, Alberto Santos Dumont had flown a powered machine in public on October 23, 1906, though his flight was a short hop of only 200 feet. In Britain, Samuel Cody lifted off on May 16, 1908. In the United States, Glenn Curtiss had flown the June Bug in July 1908. Each of these flights was witnessed by crowds and reported in newspapers. The Wrights, meanwhile, had not flown in public since 1905. Many people began to doubt their claims. The brothers had refused to provide photographs or detailed plans. The patent they had applied for in 1903 was not granted in the United States until May 22, 1906. By that time, European governments were taking action. In 1907, the French government sent representatives to Dayton to negotiate. The Wrights demanded a high price. At the same time, the United States Army Signal Corps, after months of delay, issued a specification for a heavier-than-air flying machine. The Wrights submitted a bid. On February 10, 1908, they signed a contract with the U.S. Army. The price was $25,000. The machine had to be delivered within 200 days. It had to reach a speed of 40 miles per hour and carry 2 persons for at least 100 miles. In return, the Wrights would receive a bonus for each mile per hour above the minimum. That contract forced the brothers to come out of hiding. They built a new machine, the Model A, with a seat for a passenger and a more powerful engine. They returned to Kitty Hawk in April 1908 to test and train. They flew with a passenger for the first time on May 14th. Charles Furness, a mechanic, sat beside Wilbur. The flight lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Orville later took Furness up as well, but the press was still not present. True public demonstration came later that summer. Wilbur traveled to France in June 1908. On August 8th, at the Hunaudières racecourse near Le Mans, he made his first public flight in Europe. A few hundred spectators watched, including many who had dismissed the Wrights' claims. Wilbur took off, flew a figure-8 and landed smoothly. The crowd was stunned. One French aviator, Léon de Lagrange, said, "We are beaten. We do not exist." Within a week, the French aviation community had accepted that the Wrights had achieved controlled flight years before anyone else. Meanwhile, Orville prepared for the Army trials at Fort Myer, Virginia. On September 3, 1908, he made the first public demonstration flight in the United States. He flew for 1 minute, 11 seconds. Over the next 2 weeks, he completed longer flights, some with passengers. On September 9th, he flew for 57 minutes. On September 11th, he flew for 1 hour, 2 minutes, and 15 seconds. The crowds grew. The world was watching. But on September 17, 1908, something went wrong. At 5 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, Orville took off with a passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge. The machine climbed to about 75 feet. Then the propeller on the right side detached. The machine pitched down. Orville cut the engine, but it was too late. The flyer hit the ground at a steep angle. Orville suffered a broken leg, several broken ribs, and a fractured hip. Selfridge sustained a severe skull fracture. He died 3 hours later. He was the first person to die in the crash of a powered aircraft. The accident was investigated. The cause was determined to be a fatigue crack in a propeller blade that had not been detected. Orville had not inspected the propeller before the flight. It was a simple oversight, but it had killed a man. The Army trials were postponed for 9 months. The Wrights rebuilt their machine with stronger propellers and more rigorous inspection procedures. On July 27, 1909, Orville completed the official Army tests, flying 10 miles at an average speed of 42 miles per hour. The U.S. Army accepted the aircraft. By that time, Wilbur had become a global celebrity. In France, he had given lessons to wealthy students. In Italy, he had set altitude records. In Germany, he had demonstrated the machine to the Kaiser. The Wright Company was founded in November 1909, with Orville as vice president and Wilbur as president. They built a factory in Dayton and began producing aircraft. They also began suing anyone they believed had infringed their patent. The patent wars began in earnest in 1910. The Wrights held U.S. Patent 821,393, granted in 1906, which covered their system of wing warping and rudder coordination. Glenn Curtiss, who had built the June Bug and later the Golden Flyer, argued that his use of ailerons was different from wing warping. The courts disagreed. In 1910, a federal judge ruled in favor of the Wrights, ordering Curtiss to stop production. Curtiss appealed. The legal battle stretched for years. It consumed money, time, and goodwill. Many in the fledgling aviation industry believed the Wrights were stifling progress. The Wrights believed they were protecting their invention. Meanwhile, the brothers continued to refine their designs. In 1910, they introduced the Model B, which had a rear elevator and a passenger seat in front. They opened a flying school at Huffman Prairie. They trained some of the first military pilots, but the business side was never comfortable. Wilbur was the public face, but he was also the strategist. Orville was the technician, but he was deeply affected by the 1908 crash and by the constant pressure of litigation. On May 30, 1912, Wilbur Wright died of typhoid fever. He was 45 years old. Orville was devastated. He later said, "Wilbur had been my partner in all the work of the early days. With his loss, the heart went out of the business." Orville continued as president of the Wright Company, but his enthusiasm faded. He sold the company to a group of investors in 1905. The new owners combined it with Glenn Curtis's company to form the Curtiss-Wright Corporation in 1929, long after Orville had retired. After Wilbur's death, Orville gradually withdrew from public life. He became a sort of living monument, occasionally giving interviews but mostly tending to his own interests. He never married. He lived in Dayton, in the same house he built in 1904. He maintained a laboratory and pursued other inventions, including a device to improve aircraft propellers and a system for stabilizing aircraft automatically. But his primary preoccupation after 1912 was the defense of the Wright legacy. That defense became especially important when the Smithsonian Institution awarded credit for the first powered flight to Samuel Pierpont Langley, the former Smithsonian secretary, who had built a large steam-powered flying machine that crashed on takeoff in 1903. The Smithsonian displayed Langley's machine in 1914 and claimed it could have flown if the launch mechanism had not failed. Orville viewed this as a deliberate attempt to rewrite history. He lent the 1903 Wright Flyer to the Science Museum in London in 1925, and it remained there for 17 years. Only after the Smithsonian finally corrected its claims did Orville allow the Flyer to return to the United States. The machine was placed in the Smithsonian on December 17, 1948, nearly a year after Orville's death. Orville Wright died on January 30, 1948. His last public statement was a simple one: the satisfaction of seeing the aircraft that we built become a means of transportation for the world was a greater reward than any I could have imagined. But the story of the Wright brothers is not only about success. It is about what happens when a small group of people refuses to accept that a problem is unsolvable. The Wrights faced doubt from the press, harassment from patent lawyers, and the trauma of fatal crashes. They encountered official resistance from military and scientific authorities who did not believe in them. The question of why it took 5 years for the world to accept their achievement is still debated. Some argue it was their own secrecy. Others blame the arrogance of the European establishment. Still others point to the technical challenges of reproducing their results without detailed documentation. What remains undeniable is the method. The Wrights did not stumble upon flight. They approached it as a problem to be solved step by step. They built kites, then gliders, then powered machines. They measured lift and drag in a wind tunnel they built themselves. They tested control surfaces on the gliders before ever installing an engine. They documented every flight, every failure, every adjustment. When the published data of earlier experimenters turned out to be wrong, they generated their own data. When no manufacturer could build a lightweight engine, they built one from scratch. When no propeller theory existed, they derived one from their own understanding of aerodynamics. That method is what separates the Wrights from their predecessors. Many people before them had tried to fly. Some had left the ground. None had stayed in control. Control was the missing element. The Wrights understood that lift and thrust are useless without the ability to steer. They designed their machine around that principle. Every innovation they made, from wing warping to the forward elevator to the coordinated rudder, was aimed at maintaining control in three axes. Today, every aircraft that flies uses the same three axes of control: roll for banking, pitch for climbing and descending, yaw for turning. The controls have changed. Ailerons replaced wing warping. Rudders and elevators became standard, but the fundamental arrangement is the same. The pilot of a Boeing 787 uses inputs that trace directly back to the bicycle shop in Dayton. But the Wrights' influence extends beyond hardware. Their story is a case study in the value of systematic experimentation. They were not the only ones building flying machines in the early 1900s. Santos Dumont, Adair, Langley, and others were working on the same problem. But the Wrights succeeded because they treated flight as an engineering discipline, not a spectacle. They kept records. They learned from mistakes. They did not move forward until they understood why the previous attempt had failed. That approach has become the foundation of modern aerospace engineering. Every test flight is recorded. Every failure is analyzed. Every safety system is designed around the principle that control must be maintained at all times. The Wrights would recognize that philosophy, even if they would be overwhelmed by the complexity of modern aircraft. At the same time, the Wrights were not perfect. Their secrecy slowed the spread of aviation. Their patent battles delayed the development of American aircraft during a critical period. Some of their business decisions were short-sighted. By the time World War I began in 1914, the United States was far behind Europe in aircraft production and design. The Wright Company had not kept pace. The patent wars had drained resources. The design of the Wright machines had not evolved as quickly as the Curtiss machines or the European aircraft being built by companies like Farman, Blériot, and Fokker. But that does not diminish the original achievement. In 1903, the world was small. People moved at the speed of horses and trains. The idea of crossing an ocean in a day was fantasy. The idea of being hundreds of miles away from home in a matter of hours was unimaginable. The Wrights did not change the world overnight. It took decades for aviation to become practical and affordable, but they opened the door. By 1914, the first scheduled airline service had begun in Florida, though it lasted only a few months. By 1919, the first transatlantic flight had been completed by John Alcock and Arthur Brown. By 1927, Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic alone. By 1939, the first commercial jet aircraft had flown. By 1952, the de Havilland Comet began passenger service. By 1969, the Boeing 747 took to the air. And in 2023, more than 4 billion passengers boarded commercial flights worldwide. All of that began with 12 seconds over the sand at Kitty Hawk. But the Wrights' story also contains a cautionary lesson. They were brilliant, but they were also human. They made mistakes. They were defensive about their invention. They were reluctant to share credit. They fought battles that, in hindsight, may have hurt the cause they believed in. Their machine, the 1903 Flyer, was not the first to leave the ground in a powered, manned flight. That distinction belongs to a number of earlier experiments, but it was the first machine to leave the ground, fly a sustained distance, and land under control. That is the difference. The question of who really invented the airplane is still debated in some circles. Alberto Santos Dumont's supporters argue that his 1906 flight was the first that did not require a rail or a catapult. Others point to earlier flights by Gustav Whitehead or Richard Pearse. The Wrights' patent focused on their system of control, not on the mere act of leaving the ground. That definition has shaped how we understand the invention. But for most historians, the Wrights' achievement is not in dispute. The evidence is clear. The photographs, the notebooks, the witness accounts, the surviving machine, and the subsequent flights all confirm that Orville and Wilbur Wright solved the problem of controlled flight before anyone else. They built a system that worked, and they proved it in the air. What happened after that is a story of diffusion, competition, and transformation. The Wrights' invention was adopted, improved, and industrialized. The men who flew the first fragile machines became legends. The places where they tested, Huffman Prairie and Kitty Hawk, became landmarks. The dates, December 17, 1903, and the times, 10:35 in the morning, became fixed in history. And yet the underlying message remains simple. The Wright brothers were not superhuman. They were ordinary men who used ordinary methods to solve an extraordinary problem. They were not the fastest thinkers or the most educated. They were not the richest or the most well-connected. They were systematic, they were persistent, they were willing to fail and try again. That message is still relevant today. Every engineer, every scientist, every innovator faces the same choice. Accept that a problem is too hard or break it down into smaller problems and solve each one. The Wrights chose the second path. That choice changed the world. The 12 seconds at Kitty Hawk did not end with that flight. They continued, in a sense, through every flight that followed. Every takeoff, every landing, every safety system, every pilot's manual, every research paper, every airline schedule traces a line back to that morning. The line is not always straight. It has loops, dead ends, and crashes. But it has never been reversed. Today, when a traveler boards a flight from New York to Tokyo, they are benefiting from a chain of innovation that began with two brothers in a bicycle shop. The aircraft they board has thousands of systems, but the most important one is the system of control. That system was designed on a windy beach more than a century ago. It has been refined, improved, and miniaturized, but its principle remains unaltered. The pilot moves the controls. The aircraft changes direction. The flight continues. The Wright brothers would recognize that. They would marvel at the cabin pressurization, the flight management computers, the fail-safe hydraulics, the satellite navigation. But they would also recognize the fundamental act. A human being sitting in a machine, defying gravity through lift and thrust and control. That is the legacy of Kitty Hawk. It is not a museum piece. It is the operating principle of the modern world. And it began with 12 seconds. But those 12 seconds were only the beginning. The flight itself had been witnessed by 5 men, plus 1 boy and 2 members of the life-saving station. The wind had been gusting to 25 miles per hour. The sand had been cold and damp. The Wrights had been exhausted from the work of launching the machine on its rail. After Orville landed, the group stood around the flyer, talking and taking photographs. Then they made 2 more flights that day. Wilbur flew the second, covering 175 feet in about 12 seconds. Orville flew the third, covering 200 feet in 15 seconds. Wilbur flew the fourth and longest, lasting 57 seconds, covering 852 feet. That final flight ended when the flyer pitched over and was damaged by the wind as it landed. What happened next? The brothers secured the machine as best they could. They walked back to the camp and ate lunch. Later that afternoon, as they were preparing to haul the flyer back to the shed, a strong gust of wind caught it, rolling it over several times. The damage was significant. The engine was wrecked. The frame was broken. The machine would never fly again. The 1903 flyer had made 4 flights, then died on the same sand it had conquered. But the Wrights were not discouraged. They had proven that manned, powered, controlled flight was possible. Now they had to prove it could be repeated, improved, and made practical. They packed up the wreckage and returned to Dayton. They did not announce their success. There was no press conference, no telegram to the world. They sent a short notice to the local newspaper, the Dayton Journal, but the editor did not publish it. The story was considered too improbable. For the next several years, the Wrights continued working in relative obscurity. In 1904, they built a new machine, the Flyer II, which was almost identical to the first but with a slightly more powerful engine. They established a flying field at Huffman Prairie, a cow pasture 8 miles east of Dayton. The field was flat but not entirely open. There were trees and fences. The winds were unpredictable. The Wrights built a launching derrick with a falling weight to pull the machine along a rail, since the winds at Kitty Hawk were not available in Ohio. They made over 100 flights at Huffman Prairie throughout 1904 and 1905. During the summer of 1905, they achieved sustained flight. On September 26, 1905, Wilbur flew 11 miles in 18 minutes. On October 5, he flew 24 miles in 38 minutes, circling the field until the fuel ran out. The Wrights had now demonstrated that their machine could stay aloft for extended periods. They had solved the problem of control in 3 axes and refined their skills. But they still faced a critical challenge, convincing the world. They had no customers, no government contracts, no public exhibitions. They had spent years in secrecy because they feared that their ideas would be stolen before they could secure patents. They had applied for a patent as early as March 1903, before the first flight. The patent was granted in May 1906. It covered their system of wing warping and coordinated control, claiming the entire concept of lateral control through aerodynamic surfaces. However, the patent was not immediately recognized by other inventors. Several were working on similar ideas. The Wrights began corresponding with the U.S. War Department in 1905, offering to sell their invention. The War Department was skeptical. They asked for a demonstration. The Wrights refused to demonstrate unless they received a contract first. The standoff continued through 1906 and 1907. Meanwhile, other aviators were making progress. In Europe, Alberto Santos Dumont flew his 1-for-bis in Paris in October 1906, covering 60 meters in a public flight that was widely reported. In the United States, Glenn Curtiss was building engines and aircraft. The Wrights grew increasingly concerned that their work would be overtaken. They sent Wilbur to Europe in 1907 to negotiate with potential buyers. Orville stayed in Dayton to prepare a new machine. In August 1908, the Wrights finally held public demonstrations that changed public perception. Wilbur flew at Le Mans, France in a new model flyer. His flights amazed the European aviation community. He made circles, figure eights, and long straight passes. The French, who had been skeptical that the Wrights had achieved true flight, were now convinced. Orville simultaneously demonstrated the flyer at Fort Myer, Virginia, for the U.S. Army. On September 3, 1908, he flew 9 minutes. On September 9th, he flew 57 minutes. The Army was impressed, yet tragedy struck on September 17, 1908. Orville was flying with Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge as a passenger. At an altitude of about 150 feet, a propeller blade cracked. The vibration loosened a control wire. The flyer went into a dive. Orville tried to regain control, but the machine struck the ground. Lieutenant Selfridge died within hours. Orville was severely injured, breaking his left leg and several ribs. He spent 7 weeks in the hospital. What caused the crash? Investigation revealed that the propeller blade had split due to a fatigue crack. The Wrights had been using hand-carved propellers. The problem was not the design but the material. The accident set back the Wrights' progress by months, but it also proved that aviation was dangerous and that improvements were needed. Wilbur continued demonstrations in Europe. By the end of 1908, he had flown many times, carrying passengers and teaching students. The Wrights began selling aircraft to European governments and private buyers. In 1909, they fulfilled the Army contract, delivering a Wright flyer to Fort Myer. Orville returned to the air that July. The Wright Company was formed in 1909 with capital of $100,000. The brothers became wealthy, famous, and immersed in a patent war. The patent war with Glenn Curtiss began in 1909 when the Wrights sued Curtiss for infringing their control patent. The lawsuit dragged on for years. It consumed the Wrights' time, energy, and money. It also slowed the development of aviation in the United States because other manufacturers were afraid to innovate. The patent war was a bitter, personal conflict. Wilbur in particular felt that his invention was being stolen. The suit went through multiple courts. In 1910, A circuit court ruled in favor of the Wrights, but Curtis appealed. The case was not resolved until 1917, during World War I, when the government created a patent pool to allow production without legal battles. But the personal cost was severe. Wilbur Wright became exhausted from the constant legal work and the strain of defending the patent. In the spring of 1912, he contracted typhoid fever, likely from contaminated water. He died on May 30th, 1912, at the age of 45. His death was a shock to the aviation world. Orville was devastated. He had lost his brother, his partner, and his closest friend. What happened after Wilbur's death? Orville continued to run the Wright Company, but his heart was no longer in it. He sold the company in 1905. He retired from active development, though he remained involved in aviation research and served on various boards. He lived until 1948, long enough to see aviation become a global industry. He saw jet aircraft, pressurized cabins, and rockets. He saw the beginning of the supersonic age. But he never returned to Kitty Hawk after 1909. The legacy of patent war and secrecy left a complicated imprint on aviation history. The Wrights were pioneers, but their protectiveness delayed the spread of their technology in the crucial early years. By 1914, when World War I began, European aircraft manufacturers had far surpassed the Wrights in design and performance. The French and German air forces had hundreds of aircraft, while the United States still had only a handful. American pilots flew European designs during the war, yet the Wrights' fundamental contribution remains untouched. They solved the problem of control. That solution is the foundation of all heavier-than-air flight. Without wing warping or ailerons, no aircraft could be steered reliably. Without a forward elevator for pitch control, no aircraft could maintain altitude. Without a coordinated rudder, no aircraft could turn without slipping sideways. Those innovations, tested in the 12 seconds of December 17, 1903, are still in use in every fixed-wing aircraft. The Wrights also left a detailed legacy of documentation. Their notebooks, letters, and photographs survived. The 1903 flyer was painstakingly restored and is now displayed at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. It is the most revered artifact in aviation history. Visitors stand before it, looking at the fragile wood and cloth, trying to imagine the 4 flights that took place on a lonely beach. The site at Kitty Hawk has been preserved as a national memorial. The sand dunes have shifted over the years, but the markers remain. Every year on December 17th, aviation enthusiasts gather to commemorate the first flight. The ceremony includes a reenactment, speeches, and a reading of the names of those who witnessed the event. The date is etched into the calendar of human achievement. But the deeper significance is not just the date or the place. It is the idea that human ingenuity, applied systematically, can overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The Wrights were not the richest or best educated. They were not the most physically strong. They were methodical, They kept records. They learned from failure. They built on small successes. They refused to accept that flight was beyond reach. That lesson has inspired generations of engineers, pilots, and dreamers. It is the reason why, just 66 years after those 12 seconds, a human being set foot on the moon. The Apollo 11 mission used computers, rockets, and navigation systems that traced their lineage back to the bicycle shop in Dayton. The same principles of control, testing, and iterative improvement applied. Today, the aviation industry is one of the largest in the world. It moves people and goods across every continent. It connects cultures, enables trade, and saves lives through medical evacuations and disaster relief. The safety record of commercial aviation is remarkable. For every million flights, there are fewer than one fatal accident. That safety is built on a foundation of careful design, rigorous testing, and redundant systems. The Wrights would recognize that approach. They would also recognize the human element. Every pilot training program still emphasizes the importance of stick-and-rudder skills. The same three axes of control that the Wrights identified are taught in every flight school. The procedures for pre-flight inspection, weight and balance, and emergency response are rooted in the same systematic thinking that drove the Wrights to write down every detail. The story of the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk is not just a story about flight. It is a story about how ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things through patience and precision. It is a story about the power of small beginnings. 12 seconds is barely a moment, but that moment changed the trajectory of human history. From that moment, the sky ceased to be a barrier and became a path. The aircraft that now fill the air are far beyond anything the Wrights could have imagined. The speed, altitude, capacity, and complexity are orders of magnitude greater. Yet in every cockpit on every flight, the fundamental act remains the same. A human being, or a computer acting on a human's behalf, controls the aircraft through the air. That control was first achieved on a cold December morning by two brothers who refused to quit. Their names are Orville and Wilbur Wright. Their place is Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Their moment is 10:35 in the morning, December 17, 1903. Their time in the air was 12 seconds. Their distance was 120 feet. Their legacy is everything that flies. On September 17, 1908, at 5:14 in the afternoon, a Wright Model A aircraft took off from Fort Myer, Virginia, with Orville Wright at the controls and one passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, seated in the front. The flight was part of the U.S. Army's official evaluation of the Wrights machine. Conditions were calm. The sky was clear. Orville had already completed several successful demonstration flights over the previous 2 weeks, carrying passengers including military officers and government officials. This flight was meant to be a routine endurance test. The aircraft climbed to an altitude of approximately 150 feet. It made several circuits around the field. Everything seemed normal. At 5:20, as the aircraft completed its fourth pass, something was off. Witnesses on the ground heard a loud crack. The Wright propeller stopped spinning. Orville immediately attempted to glide down. He cut the engine. He pushed the forward elevator to lower the nose, but the aircraft did not respond as expected. The Model A began to pitch up uncontrollably. Orville struggled to regain control. The nose rose until the aircraft stalled. It then banked sharply to the right and dove toward the ground. At 5:21, the Wright flyer struck the earth nose first. The impact was violent. The wooden frame shattered. The canvas tore. Orville Wright was thrown from the wreckage. He was conscious but badly injured. Lieutenant Selfridge was trapped inside. He had a fractured skull. He died later that evening from a hemorrhage. He became the first person in history to die in a powered airplane crash. What happened? The investigation began immediately. Army officials and Wright engineers examined the wreckage. The Wright propeller was found several hundred feet from the crash site. Its blade had snapped near the hub. The fracture surface showed evidence of a fatigue crack that had grown over previous flights, but that alone did not explain the loss of control. The Wright Model A used a system of wing warping controlled by a hip cradle connected to cables. When the propeller broke, the cable that controlled the right wing warping became entangled with the broken blade. The cable snapped, and the wing warping system on the right side was severed. Without that cable, Orville could not control the aircraft's roll. The unbalanced lift caused the aircraft to pitch up and then dive. The forward elevator, which provided pitch control, was not damaged, but the loss of roll authority made recovery impossible. The crash raised a critical unanswered question. Why did the propeller blade fail? The Wrights had designed and carved their propellers by hand. The blade that broke had been in use for several flights. Investigators found that the crack had originated from a knot in the wood near the hub. The Wrights had selected the wood themselves, but the knot had been hidden beneath a layer of varnish. The crack had grown undetected. The Wrights had no system for inspecting propellers for internal flaws. They relied on visual checks, but the knot was not visible from the surface. The failure was not a design flaw in the propulsion concept. It was a materials defect, but it exposed a deeper vulnerability in the Wrights' approach. They were pioneers, but they were also improvisers. They had no quality control, no fatigue testing, no redundant structural analysis. They built each aircraft by hand, and each part carried the risk of hidden imperfections. Orville Wright was hospitalized for 7 weeks. He suffered a broken left leg, 4 broken ribs, a fractured hip, and severe bruising. He never fully recovered. The pain in his legs persisted for the rest of his life. The crash also cost the Wrights their first Army contract. The original contract had specified that the aircraft must be delivered by August 1908. The crash caused a delay. The Army extended the deadline, but the accident forced the Wrights to redesign the propeller attachment and reinforce the wing warping cables. The modified aircraft was delivered in June 1909, yet the deeper consequence was psychological. Orville became more cautious, more somber. He had witnessed the death of a passenger under his control. He carried that weight. The crash also prompted the first formal aviation accident investigation in the United States. The Army's report was thorough, but it contained no recommendations for pilot training or emergency procedures. The accident was treated as an isolated event caused by a material defect. The Wrights themselves accepted that interpretation. They did not change their design philosophy. They did not add redundant cables or independent control systems. They simply strengthened the propeller attachment. The system remained fragile because the entire control mechanism depended on a single set of cables. If any cable broke, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. That vulnerability would persist in many early aircraft designs for years. But the 1908 crash also had a galvanizing effect on aviation safety. It forced the U.S. Army to develop protocols for flight testing. It led to the creation of the Aeronautical Division of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, which would later become the U.S. Air Force. It established the precedent that pilots and passengers were at risk, and that regulation was necessary. In Europe, the crash was widely reported. It demonstrated that aviation was not merely a sport or a spectacle. It was a serious enterprise with real consequences. Governments began to fund research more heavily. The Wrights themselves re-examined their safety practices after the accident. They installed stronger propeller hubs and added inspection procedures. They also trained pilots more rigorously. But they never addressed the fundamental issue of redundancy. The Wright Flyer remained a machine in which a single cable failure could be fatal. It was only after Orville's crash that other designers, such as Glenn Curtiss, began incorporating multiple control cables and mechanical backup systems. The human cost of the accident extended beyond Orville and Selfridge. Selfridge was a 26-year-old Army officer and engineer. He had been a member of the Aerial Experiment Association, led by Alexander Graham Bell and Glenn Curtiss. He had designed his own aircraft. He was a rising star in military aviation. His death cut short a promising career and left a gap in the early development of American flight. His family received his body at Fort Myer and laid him to rest in Arlington National Cemetery. His name is inscribed on monuments to aviation pioneers, but he is often forgotten behind the Wrights and Curtiss. For Orville, the physical recovery took months. He returned to Dayton in November 1908, using crutches. He could not fly again until the spring of 1909. His brother Wilbur continued demonstrations in Europe, but the brothers were now separated by an ocean and by the shadow of the crash. When they reunited in 1909, Orville was quieter, more reserved. He had always been the more introverted of the two. Now he had a visible limp and a permanent sense of caution. Wilbur, by contrast, remained bold and energetic. The patent war was intensifying. Lawsuits required both brothers to testify and to travel. The strain of the crash, the legal battles, and the constant pressure to produce aircraft began to wear on both of them. How could the propeller failure have been prevented? In retrospect, The Wrights could have used metal propellers or constructed them from laminated wood to reduce the risk of hidden knots. They could have developed a non-destructive inspection method, such as tapping or weighing each propeller. They could have installed a backup set of wing warping cables, independent of the main system. But in 1908, such measures were not standard practice. The aviation industry was in its infancy. The Wrights were learning by doing. The crash was a brutal lesson, but it was also a necessary one. It taught the entire aviation community that structural integrity and control redundancy were not optional. They were essential. The immediate aftermath of the crash saw a brief dip in public confidence. Newspapers that had celebrated the Wrights now reported the accident in grim detail. Some questioned whether powered flight could ever be safe. But the Wrights were resilient. Within a year, Orville was back in the air. He completed the Army tests successfully in July 1909. The Wright Company began production. The patent war continued, and the accident became part of the lore of early aviation, a reminder that even genius could not prevent tragedy. Today, the 1908 crash is studied in aviation safety courses as a case study in latent failures. The hidden knot in the propeller was a dormant defect. The single string of cables was a systemic vulnerability. The lack of inspection standards was an organizational blind spot. These are the same categories of failure that investigators still look for in modern accidents. The 1908 crash helped establish the discipline of accident investigation. It forced the U.S. military and the emerging civilian aviation sector to think systematically about risk. In the years that followed, the Wrights continued to improve their aircraft, but they never again suffered a fatal accident during a demonstration flight. The Model A was redesigned into the Model B, with a more robust structure and a more reliable propeller system. By 1911, the Wrights had delivered more than 60 aircraft to customers worldwide. Aviation was no longer a fragile dream, it was an industry. Yet the 1908 crash remained a turning point. It was the moment when the public realized that flight could kill, and the moment when the pioneers realized that safety had to be designed in from the start. The wreckage of the Wright Model A from Fort Myer was collected by the Army and stored. Some parts were later used for training, but the aircraft was never rebuilt. The crash site is now part of Fort Myer, but no marker specifically commemorates the event. The memory of Thomas Selfridge endures in the name of Selfridge Air National Guard Base in Michigan, established in 1907. Orville Wright lived another 40 years, but he never flew as a pilot after 1908. He kept his pilot license current for many years, but he rarely took the controls. The crash had changed him. He understood better than anyone that flight was a bargain with the laws of physics, and that the bargain was not always honored. The story of that crash, like the story of the Wrights overall, is not a simple narrative of triumph. It is a story of cost. The 12 seconds of the first flight were pure success. The years that followed were a mix of victory, loss, struggle, and adaptation. The 1908 crash is one of those moments that resists easy summary. It was an accident that almost was not. It was a failure of a single hidden defect. It was also a failure of a system that had no reserves. In that way, it is a perfect example of how progress depends on both breakthroughs and breakdowns. The Wrights learned, changed, and continued, and aviation learned with them. As the 1908 crash recedes deeper into history, its lessons remain current. Every time an aircraft undergoes a pre-flight inspection, every time an engineer performs a fatigue analysis, every time a pilot checks control cables for wear, that crash is present. The knot in the wood is gone, but the principle remains. The most unexpected weakness can bring down the most promising machine. The Wright brothers understood that by the time the dust settled at Fort Myer. They did not need to be told twice. They simply got back to work. On the 30th of June 1909, Orville Wright returned to Fort Myer. The Army tests that had ended in disaster the previous September were to be resumed. This time the aircraft was a new model, the Wright Military Flyer Designated Signal Corps Airplane No. 1. The propeller hubs had been reinforced. The control cables were inspected more thoroughly, and the weather was cooperative. Orville still walked with a limp from the crash, but he climbed into the pilot's seat without hesitation. The flight lasted 1 hour, 12 minutes, and 40 seconds. It covered about 40 miles in a closed circuit, carrying a passenger for part of the journey. The Army observers were satisfied. On the 2nd of August 1909, the U.S. Army formally accepted the aircraft. The purchase price was $30,000. It included a bonus of $5,000 for exceeding the speed requirement by 1 mile per hour. The Wrights had fulfilled their contract. The nation now had its first military airplane. The successful completion of the Army trials marked a turning point. The Wright brothers were no longer merely inventors seeking validation. They were contractors, manufacturers, and business owners. On the 22nd of November 1909, they incorporated the Wright Company in New York. The capital was $200,000. Wilbur served as president, Orville as vice president. They built a factory in Dayton, Ohio, at what is now Wright Field. The facility produced the Model A and later the Model B, with improvements in engine reliability, control systems, and structural strength. By 1910, the Wright Company employed about 30 workers. By 1911, that number had grown to over 50. Aircraft were being built on an assembly line, though each one required extensive hand fitting. The demand came from military buyers in the United States, France, Germany, and Italy. The Wrights also began training pilots at a flight school in Montgomery, Alabama, and later at Huffman Prairie near Dayton. The school taught more than 100 pilots over its 5-year existence. But the success of the business was shadowed by a legal conflict that would consume the Wrights' energy and resources for years. The patent war with Glenn Curtiss began in earnest in 1909. The Wrights had filed their original patent in 1903, and received U.S. Patent Number 821,393 in 1906. That patent described a system for controlling the lateral balance of an aircraft using wing warping. Curtiss, an experienced motorcycle racer and engine builder, had designed aircraft using ailerons, small hinged surfaces on the wings, to achieve the same effect. To the Wrights, ailerons were merely a different method of achieving the same result. They sued Curtiss for patent infringement. The first trial began in January 1910 in New York. The judge ruled in favor of the Wrights, granting an injunction that prevented Curtiss from producing aircraft with ailerons. Curtiss appealed, and the case dragged on for years. The legal battle became bitter. The Wrights accused Curtiss of stealing their invention. Curtiss argued that lateral control was a broad concept that could not be owned by one party. The two sides exchanged lawsuits, countersuits, and accusations of industrial espionage. What happened during the patent war was more than a legal dispute. It was a struggle over the very definition of invention. The Wrights believed they had originated the fundamental principle of three-axis control, which included roll, pitch, and yaw. They argued that any aircraft using ailerons, elevators, and rudders in combination was derivative of their work. Curtiss and his allies argued that ailerons were a distinct mechanical solution, not covered by a patent that specifically described wing warping. The courtroom battles consumed more than $100,000 in legal fees. The Wrights' time and attention were diverted from innovation. While they fought in court, other manufacturers in Europe and the United States were designing aircraft with greater speed, range, and reliability. The French designer Louis Blériot flew across the English Channel in 1909. His single-wing aircraft, the Blériot XI, used ailerons and a stick for control, not the Wrights' lever and pulley system. In 1910, the Royal Navy purchased Curtiss aircraft for use in experiments with shipboard takeoffs. The Wrights' monopoly on flight was slipping. The patent war also damaged the public image of the Wrights. They were portrayed in some newspapers as greedy monopolists, trying to stifle progress. Curtiss cultivated a reputation as the underdog, the independent tinkerer fighting the establishment. The Wrights, who had once been celebrated as heroes, now faced criticism for their aggressive legal tactics. Yet they believed they were defending their life's work. Wilbur once said, "We did not create the flying machine for the purpose of making money, but we are entitled to the protection of our rights." The paradox was that, while the patent system was designed to reward inventors, the litigation was slowing the development of aviation in the United States. Other countries, particularly France and Germany, advanced more quickly because their inventors faced fewer legal barriers. The Wright Company built only about 100 aircraft between 1909 and 1904. During the same period, the Curtiss Company built more than 200, and European firms built thousands. The toll of the patent war was not only financial. Wilbur Wright's health began to decline. By 1911, he was suffering from fatigue and repeated bouts of illness. The stress of the lawsuits, combined with constant travel and public appearances, wore him down. On the 24th of May 1912, Wilbur was in Boston, meeting with lawyers. He complained of feeling unwell. He returned to Dayton on the 28th of May. He was diagnosed with typhoid fever. The disease ran its course quickly. On the 30th of May 1912, Wilbur Wright died at his home. He was 45 years old. The announcement was met with shock across the world. Flags were lowered to half-mast in Dayton, Washington, and several European capitals. The Wright Company issued a statement. Wilbur Wright is dead, and the world has lost one of its greatest men. Orville was devastated. He had lost not only a brother but his closest collaborator. The partnership that had defined the Wrights' work was gone. After Wilbur's death, Orville assumed control of the Wright Company. But he was not the same person. He had always been the quieter brother, the engineer who preferred the workshop to the courtroom. Now he had to manage the business alone. He continued the patent litigation, believing it was necessary to preserve the Wrights' legacy. In 1913, the U.S. Court of Appeals upheld the Wright patent, affirming that the wing warping principle was valid. But the victory was hollow. Wilbur was not there to see it. And Curtiss continued to fight, eventually developing a successful aileron system that avoided the patent by using a different mechanical linkage. The lawsuits were finally resolved in 1917, after the United States entered World War I. The war effort required the mass production of aircraft, and the government pressured both sides to agree to a cross-licensing arrangement. The Manufacturers Aircraft Association was formed, pooling patents and setting licensing fees. The Wrights received a portion of the revenue, but the invention that had once been theirs was now shared across the industry. The war also changed the nature of flight. The fragile wood and fabric machines of the Wrights were replaced by more powerful biplanes and monoplanes, equipped with machine guns, bombs, and radios. The Wright Company merged with the Curtiss Company in 1929 to form the Curtiss-Wright Corporation, a major supplier of aircraft engines for decades. Orville lived long enough to see that merger, but he never worked for the new corporation. He sold his interest in 1915, 2 years after the death of his father, Bishop Milton Wright. Orville retired from the aircraft business, though he continued to serve as a consultant and a public figure. He served on the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the predecessor of NASA. He helped shape the early development of commercial aviation, but he never again designed an aircraft from scratch. He believed that the Wrights' work was complete and that others would build upon it. What remains of the Wrights' achievement is the core of the story, the 12 seconds at Kitty Hawk. That moment is the foundation. Everything that followed, the demonstrations, the patents, the crashes, the lawsuits, rests on the invention of the first powered, controlled, sustained flight. The Wrights did not invent the airplane in a vacuum. They studied the work of George Cayley, Otto Lilienthal, Octave Chanute, and Samuel Langley. They understood aerodynamics, control, and propulsion in ways that their predecessors did not. They built their own wind tunnel, tested hundreds of wing shapes, and devised a propeller that was both an airfoil and a thrust generator. They solved the problem of control by linking the wing warping, rudder, and elevator into a single coordinated system. When they flew on that December morning in 1903, they were not lucky. They were prepared. The day itself, the 17th of December 1903, began with a 27-mile-per-hour wind. The sand was cold and damp. The Wrights wore overcoats. They set up the launching rail on the flat ground below Kill Devil Hill. The engine was warmed. Orville climbed onto the lower wing, belly down, his hips in the cradle that warped the wings. Wilbur stood at the right wing tip, steadying the aircraft as the engine spooled up. At 10:35 in the morning, the restraining wire was released. The flyer moved down the rail, lifted off after 40 feet of travel, and climbed into the air. The flight lasted 12 seconds. The distance was 120 feet. The height was barely 10 feet above the ground. Orville later wrote, "This flight lasted only 12 seconds, but it was nevertheless the first in the history of the world in which a machine carrying a man had raised itself by its own power into the air in free flight, had sailed forward on a level course without reduction of speed, and had finally landed without being wrecked." The words were careful, precise, and measured. They were the words of an engineer who knew exactly what he had done. After the first flight, the Wrights made 3 more that day. Wilbur's second flight covered 175 feet. Orville's second flight covered 200 feet. Wilbur's final flight at noon covered 852 feet and lasted 59 seconds. It ended when the flyer pitched up, stalled, and damaged its forward elevator. The aircraft was carried back to the camp. A gust of wind overturned it, destroying the frame. The Wrights did not fly again that winter. They sent a telegram to their father in Dayton. Success, 4 flights Thursday morning, all against 21-mile wind, started from level with engine power alone, average speed through air 31 miles, longest 57 seconds, inform press. The telegram was inaccurate about the longest flight. It was 59 seconds, but the news reached the newspapers. The reporting was mixed. Some papers treated it as a minor curiosity. Others ignored it entirely. The Wrights were not yet heroes. The years between 1903 and 1905 were spent refining the design. The 1904 Flyer II was flown at Huffman Prairie, a pasture near Dayton. The flights were longer but still limited. The 1905 Flyer III was the first truly practical aircraft. It could turn, bank, and fly figure eights. On the 5th of October 1905, Wilbur flew 24 miles in 39 minutes. The aircraft was controllable in ways that no previous machine had been. Yet the world did not know. The Wrights stopped flying in 1905 to protect their patent and to avoid revealing their technology. They did not fly again for nearly 3 years, while they negotiated with the U.S. War Department and European governments. Their silence allowed rumors to spread that they had never flown at all. It was only after the public demonstrations in 1908 that the world accepted the truth. That acceptance came with a price. The demonstrations cost Thomas Selfridge his life. They cost Orville months of pain and a permanent injury. They cost the Wrights their privacy and their peace. The constant pressure to prove themselves, to defend their patents, and to build a business left both brothers exhausted. When Wilbur died in 1912, the aviation community mourned, but the industry continued to grow without him. Orville lived until the 30th of January 1948, when he died of a heart attack at the age of 76. By then, commercial air travel was common. Jet engines were being tested. The war had ended and the world had changed. Orville had seen the transformation of his invention from a fragile wooden frame to a global transportation network. He had given lectures, sat for photographs, and witnessed the dedication of the Wright brothers' National Memorial at Kitty Hawk. That monument, a granite pylon on the top of Kill Devil Hill, stands 60 feet tall. It marks the spot where the first flights began, though the actual takeoff point is a few hundred feet away. The memorial was completed in 1932. Orville attended the dedication, along with Amelia Earhart and other aviation figures. He stood at the base of the monument and looked across the dunes. He said little. The wind was blowing as it always did at Kitty Hawk. The legacy of the Wright brothers is not limited to the 12 seconds. It is also in the patent suit, the crash at Fort Myer, the business struggles, and the partnership that ended with death. The Wrights were not flawless. They made mistakes. They resisted collaboration. They fought to control their invention in a way that some saw as selfish. But they also gave the world the fundamental knowledge of how to fly. Every pilot who moves a yoke to the left and feels the wing roll is using the principle that the Wrights worked out in a wind tunnel in Dayton. Every aircraft that climbs, turns, and descends with coordinated control is a descendant of the 1903 Flyer. The 12 seconds were not the end of the story. They were the beginning. In the end, the Wright brothers are remembered for their engineering, their persistence, and their unlikely success. They were two brothers from Ohio who built a flying machine out of wood, fabric, and wire. They did it without a government contract, without a university degree, and without the support of most of the scientific community. They did it with their own money, their own hands, and their own reason. And when they succeeded, they kept working. When they crashed, they rebuilt. When they lost Wilbur, Orville carried on. The story of the Wright brothers is not a simple tale of triumph. It is a story of effort, cost, and consequence. It is the story of how 12 seconds changed everything, and how everything after those 12 seconds was shaped by what they had done. Today, the site at Kitty Hawk is a national park. Visitors walk the same sand where the Wrights camped. They see replicas of the 1903 Flyer and the 1902 glider. They stand on the beach and imagine the cold morning when the first flight happened. The wind still blows, sometimes as strong as it did that day. The monument stands on the hill, and the path from the camp to the launch point is marked with stone pylons. It is a quiet place, a place of reflection. The noise of modern airports and jet engines is far away. At Kitty Hawk, the only sound is the wind and the ocean. And if you listen carefully, You can almost hear the sound of a small engine coughing to life, a wooden propeller slicing the air, and the whisper of a wing lifting into history. At 5:14 p.m. on the 17th of September 1908, a Wright model airplane took off from Fort Myer, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. Orville Wright was at the controls. In the passenger seat was Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, an official observer. The flight was part of a demonstration to win a contract to build the Army's first military aircraft. Everything seemed normal. The airplane climbed to an altitude of about 150 feet. Witnesses on the ground watched as the machine completed several circuits of the parade ground. Only a few minutes later, something was off. A propeller blade split. The blade shattered, sending fragments into the rear propeller. Both propellers stopped. The aircraft lost all thrust. Orville shut off the engine and tried to glide, but the angle was too steep. At 5:20, the airplane struck the ground nose first. Orville was thrown from the wreckage. Selfridge was pinned beneath the engine. Orville suffered a broken thigh, several fractured ribs, and a deep wound to his hip. Selfridge's skull was fractured. He died a few hours later at a nearby hospital. He became the first person ever killed in a powered airplane crash. How could this have happened? Investigators examined the wreckage piece by piece. The left propeller blade had a longitudinal crack that had gone unnoticed during pre-flight inspections. The wood had been weakened by the torque stresses of the engine. When the blade let go, the imbalance tore the other propeller to pieces. The Wrights had been pushing the limits of their design, fitting longer propellers and a more powerful engine than the 1903 Flyer had. They had not strengthened the propeller blades to match the increased load. The crash was a failure of materials, not of pilot skill. Orville later wrote that the accident was the result of a miscalculation in the strength of the propeller blades. He did not blame anyone else. He simply acknowledged that he and Wilbur had made an error. The Fort Myer crash changed the Wrights' trajectory. Orville spent months in the hospital. Wilbur was in France, demonstrating the same aircraft model to European officials. When he heard the news, he considered canceling all future flights, but he did not. He continued flying in Europe, overwhelmed by the weight of what had happened. The accident forced the Wrights to redesign their propellers, adding a stronger core and a more robust attachment. The Army contract was delayed but eventually awarded. Selfridge was buried with full military honors. Orville carried the guilt of that day for the rest of his life. Whenever he was asked about the early history of aviation, he mentioned Selfridge's name. He did not forget. In the years that followed, the Wrights faced a different kind of battle. They sued Glenn Curtiss for patent infringement. The legal fight stretched from 1909 to 1917, consuming time, money, and the brothers' health. The patent itself, number 821,393, covered a system of lateral control using wing warping. Curtiss had used ailerons, which the Wrights argued were functionally identical. The courts sided with the Wrights, but the litigation alienated much of the aviation community. Some historians argue that the patent war slowed American aviation development, forcing innovators to pay royalties or leave the country. The Wrights did not see it that way. They believed they had earned the right to control their invention. They had spent years perfecting it. They had risked their lives and their reputations. They were not about to let someone else profit from their work without permission. Yet the cost of that defense was high. Wilbur, already frail from overwork and stress, died of typhoid fever on the 30th of May 1902. He was 45 years old. Orville was left alone to run the company, fight the lawsuits, and carry the family name into the future. Without Wilbur, Orville's involvement in aviation gradually faded. He sold the Wright Company in 1915 and retreated to Dayton, where he lived quietly. He served on boards, advised the government, and watched the industry he had started grow beyond his control. He never flew as a pilot again after the Fort Myer crash, though he occasionally rode as a passenger. His last flight was in 1944, aboard a Lockheed Constellation. That aircraft had a pressurized cabin, a tricycle landing gear, and 4 engines. It could carry more than 40 passengers across the Atlantic. The distance between Kitty Hawk and the modern world was now measured in years, not feet. Orville, sitting in a comfortable seat at 30,000 feet, must have felt the weight of that distance. He had seen the impossible become ordinary, and he had done it with his brother, whose voice was long gone. The Fort Myer crash, the patent wars, the quiet retreat to Dayton, these are not the details that make the headlines. They do not appear in the short histories, but they are the texture of the real story. The 12 seconds were not a fairy tale. They were the beginning of a difficult, complicated, and costly journey. Every aircraft that flies today carries the marks of that journey. The reinforced propellers, the legal protections, the safety protocols, and the memory of the man who died so that others could learn. When the wind blows at Kitty Hawk, it still sounds the same. But the people who stand on the dunes now understand that the first flight was not a perfect moment. It was a human moment, and that is why it still matters.